Thank you, Ravi, and good morning. I'm definitely in the glass half full optimistic camp, which is quite an achievement for a government minister. When I was growing up in the 80s, just down the river, a few miles in East London, the prevailing political philosophy of the time was that government was the problem, not the solution. And that didn't really reflect my own experience. The state helped my mum to feed me, clothe me, house me, to keep me healthy and to educate me. And I would say that standing here today as a cabinet minister in a Labour government, that I am here in no small part thanks to the wise investment of the British taxpayer. But nonetheless, there was a bigger idea in the 80s that held sway, that government needed to get out of the way, that lower taxes and lower spending was the route to economic prosperity and therefore to liberate people to look after themselves. This Thatcherite, Reaganite approach was a response to the post-war years where successive governments rebuilt and ran Britain through an ever-increasing entourage of nationalised institutions. And it's pretty obvious to say, but the picture today is much more complicated. Just consider this for a moment. If you knew in 2010 that 15 years later, spending on health will have increased by around £65 billion and on welfare by about £30 billion, you'd be forgiven for incorrectly predicting which party won the 4 general elections in that time. You might also have wrongly assumed that NHS waiting times would have remained short, poverty would have continued to fall, and that Britain had been transformed into an egalitarian nirvana. There are two different conclusions to draw from our recent history. The first is the dominant narrative on the populist right, that the public sector became bloated but things got worse. In their interpretation, the results prove that our problems will be solved with a British version of Doge or Millet's chainsaw. An alternative analysis is that too many powers, resources and responsibilities were taken away from the front line and put in the hands of quangos and arm's-length bodies. We could call it the Andrew Lansleyfication of the British state. These centralised, remote and unaccountable public bodies left the people who work in public services disenfranchised and the people who use them disaffected. Seen through this lens, it's no wonder that a recent study funded by the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust exposed a systematic decoupling of people and power. Nearly every democracy around the world faces a similar crisis of governance. It's not that people don't still support the idea of democracy, it's just that large numbers of them have lost faith in the institutions that are needed for democratic governance. To reverse this trend, we need a new playbook to get things done. Because only by delivering for the patient, the passenger and the pupil can we prove that progressive politics can still meet the needs of people in 2025 and beyond. This is precisely what the Prime Minister is arguing for and leading with his mission-driven government. One that doesn't turn a blind eye to the failures and limitations of the state, but retains our core belief that government can be an engine of progress. Right from the outset, Keir made crystal clear to all of us in his government that he expects us to be different from what came before. Substance over style, hard graft over empty slogans, delivery over excuses. As Keir puts it, an end to sticking plaster politics. The truth is that no one other than the political purists care about whether you work with businesses or with trade unions to get things done. What ultimately matters to most people is only what works. As much as we might all wish it, new ministers don't come into power waving a magic wand that makes problems disappear. What we have to do is set ambitious goals and then work out how we meet them by drawing on all the resources available to us. That's what we're doing with our approach to NHS reform. It starts by recognising the enormous expertise, experience and enterprise of the 1.5 million strong NHS workforce. We want to motivate and liberate this army of public servants, and our reforms are designed to unleash their full potential. That's why we're abolishing NHS England and a number of bodies in and around the NHS which are well-intentioned but poor use of taxpayers' money. Instead, the funding and the responsibility those bodies held will be devolved to the front line. That will come with greater accountability, but providers will also be given greater freedom to innovate and do more of what works and less of what doesn't. Some of that ambition will come from the latest scientific and technological breakthroughs. We've identified 5 technologies, what we're calling our 5 big bets, to drive healthcare reform, because we believe that data, AI, genomics, wearables and robotics will not only transform healthcare, but empower NHS staff and leaders. Power will ultimately be placed in the hands of the patient, not only so they have a better experience when using the NHS, but so their feedback can change and drive improvement. Under these reforms, patients will have a voice and a choice. That's the NHS reform agenda. It's essential if we're to rescue the NHS from the biggest crisis in its history and make it fit for the future. But simply reforming the NHS is not sufficient. Lord Darcy's diagnosis was clear that just as the National Health Service has deteriorated, so with it has the nation's health. Britain and British people are getting sicker and falling into ill health earlier in life, creating a rising tide of cost and demand that threatens to overwhelm our health service and hold back our economy as well as people's lives. That's why our 10-year plan is a 10-year plan for health, not just the NHS. And it's why Labour's health mission didn't just promise to cut waiting times, it promised to close the gap between the richest and poorest regions and help everyone live well for longer. In a deliberate departure from the old way of doing things, we are pursuing wider public health reform with the mission-driven approach Keir has committed us to, drawing in housing, education, employment and the environment, because all of them shape the health of the nation. Cold, damp, overcrowded homes make people sick. That's why we're forcing social landlords to fix dangerous homes with Awab's law in honour of the 2-year-old Awab Ishak who died after prolonged exposure to damp and mould. And it's why we're extending the Warm Homes discount. Children turning up to school with hungry bellies rather than hungry minds stunts their growth and development. That's why we're rolling out primary school breakfast clubs and free school lunches to millions of children and lifting 100,000 children out of poverty in the process. Insecure, low-paid work damages people's health and their sense of well-being and self-worth. That's why we're introducing sick pay from day one in the job and giving workers on the minimum wage a £1,400 pay rise this year. And poor air and water quality leaves children too sick for school and adults too weak for work, which is why we're leading the charge on cutting emissions from transport and cleaning up our rivers and seas from sewage. Every one of the policies I've mentioned is a health policy delivered by departments other than the Department for Health. But health policy is not just a cross-Whitehall endeavour, it's also a beyond Whitehall endeavour. Active government is absolutely necessary to build a better, fairer Britain, but the state can't do it alone. It's only by working alongside business, local government, charities, civil society and communities that we'll be able to deliver the change our country is crying out for. And why wouldn't we? Think about the resources at our disposal when we bring the country together to face collective challenges. Why wouldn't we harness the revolution in AI, genomics and machine learning taking place in our universities, life sciences sector and emerging tech sector to predict and prevent disease? Why, as we design the new neighbourhood health services, wouldn't we give our nation's mayors and local health leaders a seat at the table when they see every day the consequences of damp housing, dirty air and grinding poverty? Food firms know more about the diets of their customers than their GP does. Apple knows more about their health and fitness routines. Celebrities and influencers can drive healthier purchases and behaviours better than any government decree. That's why we enlisted Joe Wicks to inspire children to get more active and start building healthy habits from a young age. An initiative that directly supports our ambition to give children the best start in life. Imagine instead the government had tried to launch the campaign itself in the time-honoured tradition of a slew of leaflets, a press release, and a middle-aged man in a suit on the evening news. I don't know who wrote this. I feel like I've just put myself out of a job. However, it says here, I'm self-aware enough to know that kids are more likely to tune in and listen to Joe than the health secretary. We're supposed to say, no, no, no. Give the people what they want. But seriously, when it came to tackling the obesity epidemic, we didn't want to just reach for the old playbook. One of the media highlights from my first year as health secretary, some of you may have seen it, was being badgered to tuck into a plate of sweets live on Sky News by Trevor Phillips as I was outlining our plans to tackle the obesity crisis. It was a decent stunt for telly, it was very tempting, and I was glad that I didn't give in to my worst instincts in that moment, although I can't claim that I didn't take some as I left the studio during the ad break. But really, it distracted from an important point about how this government does policy differently. Because I was there to promote the new healthy food standard that we developed thanks to Nesta, where we work with the food industry to make the healthy choice the easy choice. What's different about this approach is that it's not about government dictating what people can and can't eat. And it's not about government dictating what businesses can and can't sell. It's a new approach that builds partnerships to solve the country's biggest challenges. And when it comes to health, obesity is definitely one of those. Almost 2/3 of adults and more than 1/3 of Year 6 kids in England are overweight or obese. Only 1/3 of adults and 1/5 of children eat at least 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day. This has massive costs on a personal level, of course. But the knock-on effects for the economy and wider society through ballooning costs in the NHS, unemployment and lower productivity are just as substantial and, quite frankly, unsustainable. It's that double whammy that makes it critical to improve people's health and at the same time reduce NHS costs, boost the labour market and keep taxes down. But the rise in obesity isn't the result of any one programme or policy or product or promotion, so it can't be solved by any one programme or policy or product or promotion. Instead, we're urging companies to do what they're good at and encourage consumers to buy healthier foods. Yes, we'll make them accountable with mandatory reporting and we'll push the largest companies to deliver change with targets. But we'll work with industry as we design those targets, and it will be up to them to decide how they meet them. We're not micromanaging. What we're saying to the food industry is, you can do this however works best for you. For stores and supermarkets, that might be placing products differently around the shop, changing the foods they offer price promotions on, or how loyalty points are apportioned. Consider also recent breakthroughs in weight loss medication. There's no way we're going to ignore the immense impact that such scientific innovation can have for patients, nor their widespread appeal. The risk is that these medications become the preserve of those who can afford them, while poorer people are left behind. So to be true to the NHS's founding values, I'm determined to expand access to weight loss services and treatments free at the point of need. To that end, we're working with Eli Lilly on ways to make sure those treatments reach more patients who need and want them, not just those who can afford to pay. By harnessing the power of partnerships with industry, we can transform our prospects of overcoming a seemingly insurmountable challenge like obesity. This is mission-driven government in action, bold in its ambition, practical in its approach, open in its partnerships, rigid about its goals, but flexible about how to meet them. Slowly but surely, we'll trim Britain's waistline by building a coalition of the willing behind policy that works for government, for families, and indeed will reward businesses themselves. A healthier nation means a more productive workforce, helping to drive growth and fund public services. And it means NHS and welfare costs will drain less of the nation's resources. Investing in health is not just about compassion, it's about resilience. And pound for pound, it's one of the smartest investments government and employers can make, because a healthy, thriving society is the foundation of a healthy, thriving economy. Why wouldn't businesses want to get involved? Why wouldn't they want to be part of this country's resurgence? Why wouldn't everyone? This is a government that recognises that times have changed, that when we came into office, the country was weary, that public services were broken, that trust in the state had collapsed. The range, depth and complexity of the challenges facing us demand a different approach from the government. Unlike the right, we believe in the capability of frontline staff to drive change and that markets can and should be managed and shaped. Unlike the old left, we believe that government can't do it alone. This is the promise of mission-driven government, setting audacious targets, then using all the levers available to us to achieve them. Of course, we can't do everything for everyone, everywhere, all at once. We are just at the beginning of this journey. But if we succeed, and we will, then we will have built a healthier, fairer, more equal and more prosperous Britain together. And that is the prize for this mission-driven government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wes. I'm going to go to the audience for questions shortly, but I'm just going to do a couple with you first. I actually want to pick up, first of all, on one of the themes of this conference, which is what's the thing you actually feel most optimistic about within the NHS or your health brief that you think is going to deliver real change in the next few years?
Two things, because I'm that optimistic. The first is that on the public health agenda, the public are ahead of the politics. And I've really welcomed in recent days and weeks the challenge that we've had from think tanks who worry that the powerful vested interests that have stunted progress on public health and prevention will choke off progress under this government, just as they have under previous governments. But perhaps even more encouragingly, because the evidence has always been on the side of public health and prevention, is the political coalition that exists. I'm not talking about Parliament necessarily, where extraordinarily 5, 6, I mean, it's hard to keep track from one week to the next, but the Reform group of MPs, tiny group in Parliament, the tail wagging the dog of the Conservative Party, who are just all over the shop on public health. And many of them even voting against legislation that they had drafted in terms of tobacco and vapes. So I'm not really talking about Parliament when I talk about the political coalition. I'm talking about the political coalition that unites editorial lines in The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph. You know, I think people can see that the healthy choice is not just the fairer choice, it's the sound money, strong economy choice as well. So I think there is a coalition that we can build of the left and the centre-right, even if the populist right are off surrounded by a cloud of smoke in the corner listening to Nigel Farage. And then on health service reform, the thing that gives me optimism is when you look through the 10-year plan, you know, the ideas that are in there, the innovation that's in there, these aren't things that have been cooked up by policy wonks, no offence, in my department, I was going to say.
Suits, policy wonks, it's not a very welcoming environment here, is it?
No. No, although I probably shouldn't say this, but on the way in, someone was describing the audience, said really young, really dynamic, so quite different from the King's Fund, which I thought was really harsh. Really harsh on the event I was at yesterday, and probably won't get invited to again now. But no, the thing that gives me optimism is so many of the great ideas in the 10-year plan, and so many of the central planks of our health service reform agenda are things that are not theoretical, hypothetical, things that are already proven in practice as the exceptional, outstanding practice that we seek to make the normal, the everyday, taking the best of the NHS to the rest of the NHS. And that's what gives me confidence that it will actually work, because we don't have to imagine we're proving what works, and we're seeking to expand across the whole health service.
And one of the big ideas in the 10-year plan was the idea of neighbourhood health services. And one challenge I see there is you don't just want to roll something out when we don't know exactly how it's going to work, nor do you just want to be stuck in a kind of pilot that then never goes anywhere. How do you get this balance right between being experimental but also, delivering things at pace?
Well, I think it's a few things. Firstly, we had a massive conversation ahead of the launch of the 10-year plan. We mobilised huge numbers of people who use the NHS, people who work in it or work adjacent to the health service in a wide range of ways. And that was crucial for developing the thinking in the plan, but the conversation didn't stop when we launched it. In fact, whether it's the approach we're taking on neighbourhood health, whether it's clinical pathway reform, whether it's how we're approaching technology and innovation, the conversations are continuing as people are actively engaged on the implementation side. So that conversation is a combination of kind of the national frameworks that we're putting together in terms of new governance, new models, new funding flows and incentives, but crucially, we're walking the talk when it comes to giving power away and testing and learning, trying new things and giving people the freedom to innovate and do things differently. Because a neighbourhood health approach for somewhere like Workington or Whitehaven will look very, very different to the neighbourhood health approach that will be needed in Westminster. And so recognising that and walking the talk on devolution and freedom to innovate is both a big change in how Whitehall works, and it is a revolution in the way that the NHS works as the last centralised state monopoly in the country. Far too top-heavy, far too top-down. So there's a big culture change, and I genuinely think that unless there is a change in culture as well as systems and processes, we're not going to see changes to practice or outcomes.
And just finally, on the healthy food standard, the history of public health legislation and regulation is often that things get watered down, they get delayed, kicked into the long grass. How are we going to avoid that happening here? I think what I hear from industry is that you need to act quickly and show resolve and commitment, because otherwise there's a risk that this just gets watered down.
Yes, I want to move very quickly on publishing the data, because it's already there, and I think that will kind of show us the picture of where the country is today and what sales look like. I want to work with the industry on implementation, because one of the reasons you've seen mixed reactions from supermarkets is they've got different business models, different customer bases, therefore different starting points, and their fear is they've got different commercial risks. The message I've always heard from industry on public health is you need to do this as government and you need to regulate to create a level playing field, because there is very little commercial advantage. In fact, there's often commercial pain and disadvantage if you're the first mover. And we've seen this when supermarkets have tried things like not having volume price promotions with alcohol sales during major football tournaments, for example, because of the link to violence against women and girls. And when they did that, what happened? They lost profits and market share, so they didn't do it again. So you've got to try and take industry together. But in this area, recognising that, if you're Iceland, you've got quite limited shop floor space. They tend to be much smaller stores. So if I were to dictate and say, actually, I'm going to be even more prescriptive about what can be sold where in the shop, that is a much harder task for an Iceland than a Tesco Extra. And so understanding through dialogue and discussion what the different commercial risks for retailers is, I think is really important for making sure that we don't end up with unintended consequences, that we take people with us, because ultimately part of this agenda is making sure that whether you shop in Sainsbury's or Tesco or Aldi or Lidl or M&S and Waitrose, that ultimately we're helping to improve the nutritional value of the average shopping trolley and shopping basket. So doing that through dialogue is really important. And that's why I think some of the industry anxiety about the approach we're taking, while perhaps understandable from that commercial context, actually I think in terms of the way that we're approaching this, both through wanting to work together on design, but crucially setting people free to innovate and to do what they think will work with their business model, with their customer base to improve nutritional value, is absolutely the right approach, because the opposite is more dictation, which I think actually offers greater commercial risks. More freedom to innovate actually means that people can use their own expertise, their own insight, and come up with an answer that fits their business model. So that principle I described about health service reform, Whitehaven, Workington, will look different to Westminster, so that will be true in a commercial environment too. How Sainsbury's and Tesco go about this will look very different from how Waitrose and M&S would go about this.
Great, thank you. Let's take 3 questions in one row. If you can make them really quick, so we can make best use of the time. Let's take the gentleman there.
I'll try and make answers brief, because that's usually the...
Lady there, and then Tony there. Yeah.
So drawing attention to Nesta's wonderful programme called UK Options 2040, which is about making society for this young audience better in 2040. They commissioned lots of papers, including IFS, on tax and public finances, the fundamentals, designed to help ministers and the public understand this stuff. Could you please, A, read it, B, give one to each of the Cabinet members before the next budget, and because I'm helping to promote it down in Bexhill-on-Sea, and if you could promote it up here, it would be great, because it is a very, like your speech, inspiring, intelligent, grown-up, long-term, and very sensible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lady there.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my question. I was wondering if you could speak, please, a little bit about how the NHS 10-year plan will help halve the government's mission to, or halve VOG in a decade, considering the NHS has the most contact with people experiencing domestic abuse, and 89% of domestic homicide reviews published last year had recommendations for health. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That definitely upped the level of the glass quite a lot. There was a line in your speech I liked very much, which said, Apple knows more about your diet and your habits than your GP does. And I was just wondering, it seems to me there are 3 things that you could do there. You could increase Apple's role in health, you could increase GPs' access to data, and the third one is you could empower citizens more. And can you tell me a little bit about which of those 3 and how you're thinking about doing something about that very, very pertinent observation?
Yeah, I'll take them in reverse order. So very much number 3 for me, not least because if Apple were sat here, they would say that the way they manage data, I mean, they very much give it to their customers, so they wouldn't be able to share data in the way that maybe a more interventionist way would lead. And also, I think when it comes to data, where there are, I think the public want to be reassured that their data is being held securely and that their data is being used ethically. I would add a third one on behalf of the public, which is we should be in control of our data. We should determine who it's shared with, how it's shared with. We should have ownership and oversight of that process. I think that takes everyone with you. It means that whether you are a bit, just sick of marketing and push ads and you want that kind of deactivated, or you want much more personalisation, so you'll just turn everything on, or the extreme end of the spectrum, you're wearing a tinfoil hat and think that everyone is spying on you and that government is frankly efficient enough to spy on you in that way. There's something for everyone in there. And so very much putting the citizen in control. I would like people to be able to share, if they wanted to, with the NHS, the analytics on their mobile phones and their step count and Apple Fitness or any of the other apps that people are using. But I think it should be for patients to choose how to do that. The VOG question is a really important one because we've got an important role to play in the NHS, and not just in terms of support, treatment, rehabilitation for victims of violence against women and girls, or indeed work with perpetrators or potential perpetrators to minimise and try and eliminate the risk of them going on to commit any or further acts of violence against women and girls. There is also just the point about detection of violence and knowing how to spot the telltale signs. We have so many eyes and ears on people who are at risk on any given day. but we've got to make sure that our staff have the time and the tools to do the job and to be able to identify signs of women in particular, but other victims too, who might be victims of that violence, and to support people to escape. And I'm doing some work with Jess Phillips on this, and we'll have more to say about that in the coming weeks and months. The final question is the easiest one. Fiscal policy is a matter for the Chancellor. I will take that as a budget representation. I will read it, and I suspect I will agree with it, but we'll have a look.
Okay, can I take 3 more over here? So can I take gentleman there, the lady at the back, and the person at the back there. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. Where's Rayan Hack? I work for Martin Lewis's charity. On Tuesday, I visited the Barnsley Street Mental Health Centre. So it's an NHS trailblazer. So it provides 24/7 support to those with severe mental health needs to address their debt problems, their housing issues, and crucially also to support them into work. It only launched in July, but they told me that the funding is going to run out in April. So that's not enough to pilot it. So would you commit to providing them with long-term funding? And the other reason why I mention this is that previously I led the national campaign to create the country's first ever community wealth fund, and had to convince the then Conservative government a few years ago to do that. And they were initially quite sceptical, but they did commit to it. And so Secretary Wes also reaffirmed it. So it shows that with the right political will, you can provide long-term funding. So I hope you'll do that for Barnsley Street Mental Health Hub and other hubs around the country.
I think he might refer to Rachel Reeves in a second again. But anyway, yeah.
Thanks. Ravi talked about science as a point of light and optimism. You talked about your tech big bets. I was wondering, with declining budgets, what needs to change to ensure that R&D really is at the heart of the future NHS?
Yeah, the gentleman there.
Getting in our step counts, walking around with the mics. Thank you, Borodar, Secretary of State. I work for the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, back over the border. You were cautious about dictating to industry what it should do, but I wondered if you could reflect on, particularly in food, across the public sector, in what it procures, what it sells, and what it advertises on its sites, as a means to try and improve the food that is offered across the public sector.
Yeah, again, another round of great questions. On that latter point, I think you're absolutely right about the role of the public sector in procurement and thinking about the nutritional value of food that we provide, whether to pupils or to patients. I'm working with Bridget Phillipson, our Education Secretary. I may have heard of her in recent days, and we're working together on improving the nutritional value of school food. I will be looking at what's going on in terms of NHS food as well, trying to resist the temptation of being yet another health secretary to appoint my favourite celebrity chef to come along and tell me that it's not good enough and needs to improve. But I don't think we've seen, and I've certainly not experienced, the improvements to sort of healthy nutritional food in the NHS. And it's something we need to take seriously. To the second question, budgets aren't in decline in my department, but it doesn't feel like that necessarily in every part of the NHS, because I'm doing 2 things simultaneously that are entirely necessary. One is delivering increased investment into the NHS, which will be sustained over the course of the spending review period, and also reining in where I think money is not being put to best effect, and making sure we're diverting money to areas where it will be higher impact and better outcomes. So for parts of the NHS, it might feel like they're constrained, that funding's going down, but in fact it's going up, and we are rediverting to important priorities. We've got to do better on life sciences, on technology and innovation. Too often medicines have been seen as almost like a kind of dead weight cost. I'm very proud of NICE and the way that we've driven value for money as great New Labour success story, but we shouldn't just consider medicines to be a cost. We should consider medicines to be an investment in people's health, people's well-being, and a better way for people to live healthier lives for longer and have a better quality of life. And finally, I will look at the case, but obviously won't commit to an individual case. only just heard about on stage, because that would not be prudent or sensible. But we'll absolutely look at it, and one of the things we're changing about the way we do leadership in the NHS is medium-term financial planning and planning directives, so that the system can plan how to spend its money most effectively over a longer period of time without constantly shifting goalposts.
Can we take 2 more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Let's take 2 over there. Lady at the front and the lady here as well.
Hi, Helen Corbett from the PA News Agency. If I could take you to some of the news of the day. Given that some new information has come to light about Lord Mandelson's emails with Jeffrey Epstein since you were last asked, do you think he needs to go now? And who are you going to be backing as the deputy leader of the Labour Party?
2 small questions. And yes, lady at the front here.
2 questions from online. So the first is, are there more policies in the pipeline, like Healthy Start, to get in front of the public health, nutrition and obesity crisis, or are we going to rely on weight loss drugs after the fact? And the second is, the problem with access to the public's data is that it could lead to some form of social contract with the public around behaviours and access, given the huge constraints on NHS resources. What does the Secretary of State think about such social contracts and the access to public services?
I mean, I do think that there is an informal social contract for all of us, which is what I would kind of characterise more broadly in terms of my own political outlook as a rights and responsibilities agenda. And I think actually in recent decades we've heard an awful lot about the rights, but not enough about the responsibilities. And I do think we've got a responsibility in terms of how we conduct ourselves as citizens, to play our part in building a strong, successful, secure, fairer and more just society. I would tread very carefully in this area in health, though. There are examples where, for example, so ahead of some surgical procedures, for example, where patients will be required to get active and lose some weight in order for a procedure to become safer, or there might be sort of other clinical advice or guidance in order to set people up to succeed in treatment. But you do have to tread really carefully in this area. I think the challenge is, when you think about, take obesity as a really good example, this isn't just a case of people not being responsible. It is because people do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in an environment where the unhealthy choice is too often the cheapest choice. So you don't want to penalise people for being poor and turning to the solution that's affordable to them, not the one that's necessarily best for them. We are constantly being bombarded with marketing, and we often make the unhealthy choice the harder choice. So I think there's lots on us to change and shape, but I think it's a good broader question for our society and public policy. I've forgotten your first question, but I might come back to that and just go to PA in the meantime. Look, I've obviously seen overnight the latest tranche of messages and was completely disgusted by them. And as for the ambassador's position, that's a decision for the Prime Minister. And in terms of the deputy leadership of the Labour Party, I have yet to cast a nomination. Nominations close later today.
Thank you very much. With that, I'm going to say a big thank you to the Secretary of State for joining us and talking so much about mission-driven government and what you're doing to drive things forward. So thank you, Wes, for joining us.
Thank you.